What is up, family? This is part 2 to the series that we are doing on no self. And just as a refresher, in the first talk, we discussed this commonly held spiritual idea that we call no self. And we talked about some of the problems and issues and contradictions that tend to arise from this commonly held view. And in this talk, what we're going to do is we're going to extend this conversation and talk about non-duality. And the reason we're going to do this is because typically the belief in no self tends to lead to the belief in non-duality. But it tends to lead to a very specific way of seeing non-duality. And in this talk, we're going to talk about the common way that non-duality is usually seen by people that hold this view of no self versus a more nuanced understanding of non-duality. So let's start with the way that non-duality tends to be conceived by those that have this view of no self. It usually goes like this. All that exists is God. Since you and I are part of everything that exists, you and I are God. God is one being. Since God is one being, this means that you and I don't actually exist as individuals. We don't exist as individual selves. No self, right? So as you can see in this common way of seeing non-duality, it simultaneously leads to the idea that you and I are God, but we also don't actually exist as individuals. So this is the common way that it's seen. But now what we're going to do is we're going to compare and contrast this with a more nuanced understanding of non-duality, because here's the thing. There's a way to conceive non-duality where you and I still exist as individual eternal souls. It's just that this requires far more nuance. So in order to understand this nuance, let's start here. God is the source of all reality. Everything that exists emanates from God. And all of these emanations coming from God are aspects of God's energy. And when we see things in a more nuanced way, we understand that there's actually different types of energy. So, for example, there is the material energy. Like we're in this material world. There's matter here, right? It's like an insentient energy. But then there's also a different type of energy. There's the energy that is us as individual souls, as individual units of consciousness. We are sentient, right? We're different than matter. That makes us an aspect of God's energy. So in this way, we can say that all that exists is God, because God being the source of all reality and God's energy being everywhere, there's quite literally nowhere you can go where God is not. Yet at the same time, when we have this nuanced understanding of things, we understand that there's these distinctions going on. And one of these distinctions is this one aspect of God's energy is us as individual souls. So one way that this is often thought about is the sun and the sunshine. So if you picture the sun planet where the sun actually is, and then you picture the sunshine emanating from the sun, if we think of, in this example, if we think of God as being the sun, like the sun planet, and then all the individual souls existing in the sunshine, you could see that one is emanating from the other, right? Another way we can conceive this is a fire and sparks coming from a fire. And this is actually an example that's given in one of the Upanishads. It talks about a fire, and it compares the fire to God, and it compares sparks coming from the fire as the individual souls. Now, in this example, on one end, we can say that the spark is the fire, right? And in the same way, being an energy of God as a soul, we share in the same qualitative essence as God. Yet there's still distinction here. There's like this oneness, yet simultaneous distinction. And going back to the fire and the spark example, there's a few things that we have to understand here. Okay, first off, one is far bigger than the other, right? The fire is far more powerful than the spark, right? And then also, the spark comes from the fire. One is the source of the other. One emanates from the other. And in the same way, we can say that God is infinite and we are finite. We emanate from God. God doesn't emanate from us. God is the source of us. We are not the source of God. Yet simultaneously at the same time, because we're an aspect of God's energy, we also share in the same qualitative essence of God, right? And we are forever connected to God. So there's like this sameness, there's this oneness, and yet there's also this distinction. And this distinction is important. So now we're going to go back to how non-duality is usually conceived, like what we were talking about earlier in this talk, by people that hold the view of no self. And what the example that's often given, I'm sure you've heard this before, is drops in the ocean. And each one of us is compared to a drop. And this picture that's painted is that we all come together to form the ocean. And this is how God is usually conceived. But the issue with this example is that it's not showing this distinction. It's not showing one being the source of the other. It's not showing one being greater in degree than the other, right? It's just painting this picture like we all come together and we're just this one homogeneous being, right? There's no distinction of anything. So if we wanted to understand this ocean and drop example in this more nuanced way, what we would have to say is we would say that God is the ocean. God is already this massive, powerful being, right? And then if we can envision an outlet coming from the ocean, like imagine there's water coming from the ocean like to an outlet, and we picture the infinite amount of individual souls existing in that outlet, this would be a better way to conceive this. It's the same water, but God is already whole. God is already that ocean, and we come from that ocean. We're a part of, we share in that same essence of what makes the ocean, but one is far bigger in degree and one is the source of the other, right? Again, we emanate from God. God doesn't emanate from us. And when we see non-duality in this more nuanced way, it's truly it's just such a beautiful realization. It leads to this unbelievable truth, this amazing understanding that you and I exist eternally, and that we're eternally connected to God, that we exist in this unbelievably beautiful, reciprocal exchange of love. And God being that ocean, the love is so unbelievably beautiful that it's incomprehensible. how much love there is, right? But just to understand that you and I exist eternally as individuals, I mean, this is such an amazing thing to understand. It's just such a wonderful, beautiful thing. God is an eternal being that is so perfect and loving to a degree that is beyond our comprehension. And we are we're a drop of that perfection. And we get to share in this reciprocal love with God. It's just such an amazing thing to understand. And it's also amazing to understand that this is still a view of non-duality. It's just there's more distinction and there's nuance going on. And when we compare and contrast this with the common way that non-duality is seen, it's far more grim, right? I mean, because when you think about it, this idea of no self is basically self-annihilationism. Like I talked about it in the last talk. It's kind of a soft form of atheism because you and I don't really actually exist. We're not actually spiritual beings then, right? If all that exists is God without this loving relationship and these energies and emanations coming from God, there's no loving exchange. There's no relationship going on, you see? It leads to this bleak conclusion that you and I aren't even real, right? We're not really actually individual souls. It's just such a different conclusion. And it's interesting because that's considered non-duality too. But yeah, I think we will stop there, and there will probably be a third part to this talk. In the third part, we will talk about the ego's relationship in this idea of no self and seeing ourselves as God, because that's actually the ultimate ego trap. So that will probably be the last talk in this series. But yeah, until next time, guys, I hope you have a wonderful, incredible, phenomenal, spectacular, terrific, above average day today. And until next time, peace.